John Jay wrote an address to the state of New York about independence from Great Britain on the 23rd of December, 1776. This address served as a promotion for the American independence movement, and it highlighted reasons why the Americans should fight against Great Britain and why the Americans had a chance at winning the war. This was also written after the Revolutionary War was in full swing. The battles of Lexington and Concord occurred on the night of April 19, 1775, the same month that Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys successfully captured Fort Ticonderoga from the British and seized their weaponry. That was more than a year and a half before this document was written. Congress had already declared independence on July 2, 1776, and the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th. The battles of Long Island took place from August to October 1776, and George Washington's army was suffering from a shortage of soldiers. The Battle of Long Island was a major defeat for the Americans, and George Washington lost thousands of soldiers from his already squalor army. The battles of Bunker and Breed's Hill took place on June 15th and 16th, 1776, and the British left the city of Boston in March 1776. The battles of Trenton and Princeton occurred in late December 1775 and early January 1776, during and after John Jay gave his address. With John Jay's address to the state of New York, John Jay hoped to help the war effort by convincing Americans to join the army. John Jay explains that the freedom and happiness of Americans is at stake, and of future generations of Americans. He highlights the ideas of duty to God, the Creator, and the importance of faith throughout his address. The great God of the universe created you and all men free, and authorized them to establish a government for the preservation of their rights, and not oppression and the security of liberty he hath given them. John Jay is claiming that God created all men to be free, and that if the government did not allow for its citizens to be free, then Americans are disobeying God's orders. Americans need to be loyal to God over all things, and then be loyal to their country. John Jay is also illustrating the idea that all people have natural rights, and it is the government's duty to protect these rights for all of its citizens. John Locke, an English professor, first popularized the idea of natural rights in his second treatise concerning government. John Locke's ideas are now known as Whig ideology, and Locke's treatise was not published under his own name because his ideas of a new government were so radical and different at the time. In his second treatise concerning government, Locke stated that the government is morally obligated to serve the people and to protect life, liberty, and prosperity. These same words were used in the Constitution, and Locke's ideas of natural rights were stated in the Declaration of Independence. He explained how a system of checks and balances can limit the federal government's power to keep the government from becoming a tyranny. Locke even supported a republic and insisted that if the government violates individual rights, then the people have the right to rebel. John Locke's ideas greatly influenced the way the federal government was created, and John Jay mentions most of these radical ideas throughout his address in the hope of convincing more Americans to join the army. The Magna Carta of 1215 stated the rights that all English citizens had, and one of those rights was the right to representation in Parliament. Americans were not represented in Parliament because England was over 2,000 miles away from the colonies, and representatives could not properly represent the colonies if they were so far away. Because of this dilemma, the colonists created their own local governments so that they could be active in their own governments. But when Parliament started to tax the colonies to pay off the debt from the French and Indian War, colonists grew angry because they were taxed without representation in Parliament. This anger escalated into protests, riots, and then armed conflicts, gearing up to the Revolutionary War. John Jay commented on England's lack of funds for another war when he states, "Their country, drained of men and money, and the difficulty of supplying a fleet and army at so great a distance. Because England had no money, and they would have to send a fleet so far away, the colonists would have a strong chance at winning the war." In the third paragraph of John Jay's address, John Jay brings up Locke's ideas of the ideal federal government and reminds Americans about how God is the center of all things. Under the auspices and direction of the divine providence, your forefathers removed the wilds and wilderness of America. Permit our country is contaminated by irreligion, and the many shameful are oppressed. America's forefathers were the first to come to America under the direction of God, and now the country is filled with non-religious people and oppressed citizens. Americans need to be faithful to God, and if Americans are not, future generations will be forced into slavery and servitude. The Great Awakening movement first started in 1735, when Jonathan Edwards began radical spiritual conversations in his Northampton, Massachusetts congregation. He believed that Americans and Englishmen were experiencing religious struggles because they were not keeping God at the center of their lives. This movement soon spread all over New England and down to the middle and southern colonies as citizens tried to be more faithful in their lives. John Jay is sympathizing with these Americans from the Great Awakening because the Great Awakening movement was still occurring over 40 years after it had started, and he needed all Americans to support the revolution. John Jay also makes historical references to the tyrants of Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and Rome, who became unfaithful to their gods and were severely punished. John Jay commented on the success of the Roman Republic on page 3 of his address when he states, "They remembered that their ancestors had left them free, ancestors who had bled in rescuing their country and their city. With undaunted resolution, they repelled the enemy and recovered their country. Who can read the noble magnanimity of those illustrious citizens without blushing for the degenerate?" John Jay thought the Romans were a great civilization because their citizens came together and were able to overthrow the tyranny of Hannibal in order to rescue their country. The Romans honored their ancestors by rescuing their country, and the illustrious citizens were completely united in their revolution. If the Romans could have a successful republic and could take back their country, then why could the Americans not do the same? John Jay referenced historical events to convince Americans that their armies had a strong possibility of winning the war. John Jay highlighted the success of recent revolutions for independence in the Netherlands and Switzerland when he stated, "There was a long and glorious struggle between Holland and Spain. These states were once subject to Spain. Their extent was small, their country poor, their people far from numerous. Spain attempted to enslave them, their petitions treated with contempt and fire and sword, and were carried into their country to compel submission. Holland was able to gain freedom from Spain in the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War started in 1618 and raged sporadically between the major European powers, mainly France and the Holy Roman Empire. Holland was a small and weak province, but by rebelling at exactly the right time, while Spain was weak, they were able to gain their freedom. If colonies seized this opportunity and conjured their full strength to combat Great Britain, John Jay argues that the colonies would have a strong chance at winning the war. He stated that Spain rejected Holland's petitions for peace and for independence. Spain instead sent soldiers and mercenaries to combat the revolution. This is similar to how King George III ignored the olive branch petition that the colonists sent to Great Britain, which asked for peace rather than declaring war, and sent soldiers to America to put down the revolution. The second petition traced the history of the colonies from the time of the Revolution, listed again colonial grievances, advocated a return to pre-1763 conditions, pointed out the barbarity of the war and the desirability of peace, and requested the king to draw up a plan of reconciliation. King George III thought that the colonies lost all respect for their authorities, and that the colonists needed to be put down. He thought that Great Britain had every right to tax the colonies, as they had throughout the late 1760s and early 1770s. John Jay saw the revocation of the Olive Branch Petition and the colonies' other declarations of grievances as a connection to the other revolutions in which their petitions for peace had been ignored, and as a potential argument to fight against Great Britain. On the second page of John Jay's address, John Jay questions why the colonies ever thought that Great Britain would seek peace instead of war. Why, if there had been a single idea of peace in his mind, does he order your cities to be burnt, your country desolated, your brethren to starve and languish and die in prisons? Why, if any thought but destruction, bloodshed, and devastation was intended, are the barbarians of Germany hired and transported near 4,000 miles to plunder your houses? In the first line of this quote, John Jay was referencing Lieutenant Henry Millot, who bombarded and burned the Falmouth waterfront in Portland, Maine, on October 18, 1775. His soldiers looted the houses in that area and burned the town as an example to other colonial towns. The lieutenant did give ample time for the inhabitants to escape, but many of them did not leave their houses because they wanted to resist the British soldiers. John Jay also emphasized how Great Britain hired German mercenaries because they were running out of soldiers of their own, and under the Quartering Act of 1774, these mercenaries were also allowed to occupy unused living spaces in the colonies. The Quartering Act deeply angered the colonists, especially colonists living in Boston, where the military at the time was most prevalent. John Jay mentioned how British kings were moved from England and how England was realizing that it had tyrannical leaders. Even England itself has afforded examples in opposition to tyranny. His Sacred Majesty Charles I lost his head and his crown by attempting to enslave his subjects, and His Sacred Majesty James II was expelled from the English kingdom for the same reason. King James II was expelled in 1689, and King George I died in 1727 in disgrace. These kings were expelled from the country that they ruled, and this shows that even a country that has a monarchy tolerates the idea of expelling corrupt and tyrannical leaders in search of a better leader for the government. By expelling these two kings, Parliament has demonstrated the Whig idea of remaking a corrupt government. John Jay uses this example to appeal to loyalists and to citizens in the colonies who are not sure whether they want to support the revolution or not. Since Parliament remade their corrupt government, then the colonies should be able to remake their government because it is not protecting their natural rights. John Jay also mentioned British impressment of American trading ships, when he said, "If a piece were an object of his desire, why did he order all your vessels to be seized and confiscated? Nay, why did he most cruelly command that the men found on board of such vessels should be added to the crews of his ships of war, and compelled to fight against their own countrymen and spill the blood of their friends and neighbors?" John Jay argued that the impressment of American ships was an act of war itself, because citizens were not forced like slaves to fight Great Britain's enemies, even if they were citizens of the British Empire. Hundreds of sailors were impressed in the 1770s on the eve of the Revolution. It goes against the moral values of citizens, because merchants are not soldiers. Impressment was another main argument John Jay used to justify the colonies' actions of going to war with Great Britain. John Jay failed to mention that England was, at the time, the most powerful nation in the world, and that they had enough resources to combat the colonies in their uprising. He also failed to admit that even though England was in massive debt, the country could still gain the funds to continue a war with the colonies. John Jay did not mention this because the address was an act of propaganda, with the sole purpose of getting more supporters for the American Revolution. John Jay brings up the ideas of natural rights, duty to God, Whig ideology of the ability to create a government, the Great Awakening, the Roman Republic, other recent revolutions in Europe that have proven successful, all in an effort to recruit more soldiers to fight for American independence. John Jay wanted to support the colonial cause, and this address was one of the ways that John Jay did so.